Hey, what's going on, everyone? Thanks for tuning into the video. Now, this video is going to be another prediction video about an excellent matchup that I'm very excited for coming out of the UK between Chris Eubank Jr. and Billy Joe Saunders. Now, if you haven't followed the build-up for this fight, these two guys generally do not like each other. And I think this is going to be an excellent fight, and we're really going to see who is the better fighter out of these two gentlemen. And this is a big fight for both of these guys moving on down the road in their career. And I apologize, guys, if my voice sounds different from most of my other videos. I'm actually battling a cold right now, so bear with me. So when I look at this fight, one thing I love about watching UK matchups, the hype and anticipation for an event is excellent. Everybody in the UK is watching the event and supporting the fighters that are fighting from the UK, and also the tension between the fighters is excellent. I remember when Carl Froch and George Groves fought, I was loving the build up to that fight, the Sky Sports stuff, interviews and the face-offs, things of that nature. And I find that over in the UK, they really do an excellent job of building up a fight, way better than in North America. And I don't understand why more people in North America do not watch the UK events. Great build up to fights, great entertaining matchups. And if you're not watching boxing over in the UK, you're really missing out. Great atmosphere and great fighters and anticipated fights. Now, with all that being said, let's move on to the matchup. Let me first talk about Chris Eubank Jr. When I watch Chris Eubank Jr., some of the skills that I see him possess are excellent hand speed, vicious uppercuts, and so far against his opponents, he's showing that he has some vicious power. Now, take that with a grain of salt, because some of these opponents he has been fighting, basically all of them so far, up until this point of his career, are not world-class opponents. Most of these guys are not very good fighters. Let's just call it like it is. Also, I love when I watch Chris Eubank Jr. when he lets the flurry of punches go. It's incredible to watch. He'll just back up a guy, he'll get in a shell, defense, really cover up, and Chris Eubank Jr. will just throw a ton of punches, land some vicious body shots, and that's really when I love watching him fight, when he has those outbursts of offense. Excellent to watch. Now, Billy Joe Saunders, let's talk about him. Most people do not know him over in North America. Some people do know Chris Eubank Jr. Due to his father and also his sparring with Carl Froch. But Billy Joe Saunders, on the other hand, is not very well known at all by the North American public. So this is a guy who is a southpaw. He has a solid jab, amateur experience. He's currently got a few titles that he holds right now. Also, he's a pretty good boxer. Some people overlook his boxing skills because he's not a very flashy fighter. He doesn't have the biggest power, but he is a guy who, technically speaking, is a pretty good boxer in my opinion. And I think some people underrate him, especially if you watch his last fight. What happened in his last fight was he came out early, very close fight. Excuse me. His conditioning did not look good towards the later part of the fight. But what happened was, while he slowed down, he actually still ended up getting his opponent out of there, which I was impressed with because it was not one of his best performances. He didn't have his A game on that night, but yet he still got the job done. So there's something to be said about that when you can dig in and pull out a victory when you don't have your A game performance-wise. So when I talk about the fight, some advantages I have to give both of the fighters. Chris Eubank Jr., I think, is the more athletic fighter of the two. I also have to give Eubank Jr. the power advantage. And when Billy Joe Saunders, I'd have to give him the advantage of being the more experienced fighter. He's been in there with the better competition. Really, he deserves to be at the stage more so than Chris Eubank Jr. at this point of his career. He's earned more in the sport of boxing. He's fought the tougher competition. He's got the titles. And I think that's a big advantage for him in this fight. That even if things go wrong in the fight and Chris Eubank Jr. starts off well, he will not get discouraged. And he's going to be calm throughout the fight. He's a composed fighter when I watch him. So I think that Billy Joe Saunders holds the advantage in that regard of the experience, just really being composed throughout the fight. That's something we don't know about Chris Eubank Jr. right now. I'm interested to see how both of these guys' stamina holds up because Billy Joe Saunders in his last fight, the stamina did not look good. And Chris Eubank Jr. isn't a guy who has a lot of activity. So when the fight goes longer on, I want to see if that's because he's worried about his stamina or he has stamina issues, or rather that's just the style that he's going to fight with throughout his career. So those are some interesting things that I want to see. I'm actually going to pick Chris Eubank Jr. to win this fight. I think that he is an underdog by most people. But I'm going to pick him to win this fight. I think that the power, and I think that he actually has a little more skill-wise than Billy Joe Saunders does. So I'm going to pick him to win the fight. I think it's going to be a very close fight, going to come down to the wire. Really, who wants to fight more? But I personally cannot wait for this matchup. You're going to want to tune in and check this out, guys. And thank you very much for tuning into the video. Shout out to everybody in the UK. Great boxing fans, very knowledgeable people on the sport of boxing. Thank you very much, guys, for tuning into the video. Thank you.